Let's get started. There are 6 simple rules. I used to have 5 simple rules. I keep making my simple rules list longer, but let's start with simple rules. If you get nothing out of tonight but this, I'd be happy if you get this. 1, insects that you see flying around your garden are not pests. Okay, there's one exception, is this little critter. This butterfly lays the eggs on cabbages, and yeah, it's an introduced species. It was native butterfly in Europe. It's been in North America for many years. But basically, if it's flying around your garden, it's a pollinator, it's a predator, it's a butterfly, it's just somebody minding his own business, not pests. Pests are out at night, pests are hidden under leaves, pests are under mulch. Think of when slugs come out and cut worms and things like that. Or they're so small and they're on the underside of leaves that you don't see them. So don't worry about the stuff that's flying around during the day. On the soil, if you pick up a rock or move some mulch or a board or something, and a big beetle takes off and runs very quickly, if it's a soil-dwelling creature living, there's a lot of creatures that live on the soil. If it's moving fast, it's a predator. You can pretty much guarantee. Think how slow wireworms move. They're not predators. They attack plant roots. But these creatures are all very fast, very wiggly, and you'll love this one. This one eats pill bugs. This one eats slugs, and all of these ground beetles, these are larval ground beetles here. These are immature ground beetles, and they're very wiggly and fast. They eat slugs and slug eggs and root weevil larvae. Here's one that you should really remember. Most disease-causing organisms, that's pathogens, and most plant pests only attack specific host plants. So, and it's usually just close or closely related ones. So here's a picture of apple scab and pear scab, and it's not even the same fungus. I mean, apple scab cannot go on pears, and pear scab cannot go on apples. And if it comes to aphids, I don't know how many aphid species there are here, but most of them are have unique host plants. So this one that's on plums over here is not going to go on your cabbage, which is a cabbage aphid here, and they're not going to go on other plants. It won't go on your roses. If it's on your beans, it won't go on your peas. So, or your maple trees. So, basically they stay in their lane. They don't cross over, and that's really good to know. Because if you do have an aphid problem, for example, or a caterpillar on a particular plant, you only have to deal with it on that particular plant. You don't have to worry about it spreading elsewhere. That's a general rule. And this one I will talk a lot more about tonight, is that disorders do more damage than pests or diseases. So we're talking about pests or diseases tonight, but I'm actually going to show you some examples of things that can go wrong that actually do a lot more damage. And a lot of them do look like disease. I mean, both of these pictures look like diseases. One is potatoes that were subjected to too dry, too wet irrigation regime. And the apple here is just suffering from a calcium deficiency in the cells. These are not disease. So it could be physical injury from high temperatures, low temperatures, poor watering practices, chemical damage. And you think, well, we're organic growers, we don't do chemical damage. But if you've ever been tempted to mix up some dish soap and spray it, you can do chemical damage on plants quite easily with soap. So most of the, confusing things that get sent to diagnostic labs, like the one in the Lower Mainland, for diagnosis, more of them are to do with something wrong with the growing environment than with pests or diseases. Now, even if there is a pest or disease problem, and despite the fact that there's some noticeable damage, rule number 5 here is there may be no need to take action. First, there's a lot of things that happen to plants that don't really make any difference to your harvest. Like, for example, these blister mites on grapes have zero impact on the grape harvest or on the quality of the fruit. They're not on the skin, nothing of the grapes themselves, nothing. Or, it may look quite damaging, but it's not doing any real harm to a plant. Trees are, people say, well, trees are really over-engineered. A tree can have a lot of chewing on it by caterpillars and still not experience any loss of crop or severe consequences. So it just may not be that damage matters at all. Or it may be that the damage could be controlled, but it's too expensive to do, or you don't want to use a method that is available. And it's also possible that if it was insect damage, there may be damage, but by the time you go and look at it, there's enough natural enemies, and there are lots of insects that eat other insects present already, and there's really nothing you need to do. And then a very common thing is you notice the damage, it was too much damage, but you didn't even see it until it was too late to do anything about it. We really only notice severe feeding damage on plants as the insects that have eaten it have just about finished eating and they're moving on to the next stage of their life cycle. They leave the plants and then we come and discover, oh, all my gooseberry leaves have been chewed up or something. And all that damage happens very quickly in the last few days of the life of a caterpillar or a sawfly or something, and we miss them. And here's my sixth rule, is my recent one, is don't be afraid of caterpillars or their damage. Just this a little aside here. I'm not really going to talk about this too much more tonight, but if you want more information about this whole issue, there is a presentation, the PDFs of a slide set are on my website here, Where Have All the Insects Gone? But I just want you to remember that most birds, bats, vertebrates eat insects that ate plants. 96% of our birds, not our aquatic birds, but the ones that, our songbirds that are migrating through, depend mostly on caterpillars to feed their chicks. Even the seed-eating birds feed chicks, caterpillars. And the birds that eat insects are declining faster than any other bird group. I mean, they're down almost 60% in Canada in the last 50 years. And global insect populations have gone down that much as well. I mean, it ranges from depending what the study is, 45% to 80% decline in insect population. So there's nothing for the birds to eat. So if birds are to survive, they must have caterpillars. Caterpillars are a source of carotenoids, which come from plants. And carotenoids turn out to be an essential nutrient for baby birds for development of their feathers, and they cannot complete a life cycle without it. And just as an indicator here is a recent study showed that it takes more than 9,000 caterpillars for one pair of chickadees to raise their nest of chicks up to fledgling stage. So, and it even takes more caterpillars than that to actually feed them, because the parents continue feeding them for a while after they've left the nest. So don't be afraid to let caterpillars go in trees, Gary oak, a lot of things. There's no need to have to control them, because remember the earlier rule, insects are pretty much, pests have unique hosts. And so if it's chewing on your Gary oak, it's not going to chew on your apple tree. So that said, I'm going to move right into prevention, which is like the easiest way to have a nice easy life as a gardener and a lovely bountiful garden, is you just prevent problems before they start. So the first one is don't bring home problems. Be aware that there are some pests that you can basically only buy. They come to you on your Mother's Day azalea, that would be white flies, or house plants like soft brown scale, and they come to you from someone else's greenhouse. Mealybugs, spider mites, and they're actually rather difficult to control. And there's a couple really nasty diseases of vegetables that you can only get by bringing infected stock to your place. These things don't fly around in the air, and they may get moved by water over land, but mostly you get white rot on garlic because you planted garlic bulbs that had spores on them. And you get clubroot of cabbage because you planted plants that had soil in their roots usually from somebody else's garden, and that they had clubroot spores there. Now, if you go to a garden nursery and bought cabbage plants, those plants have been grown from seed in a soilless mix, and that is not how you get clubroot. You get clubroot by, someone, a good friend passing you something out of their garden where they have clubroot, and they may not even know. So be really wary right there about bringing anything home that might have problems. The next thing is grow healthy plants. Well, of course we want to grow healthy plants. I mean, that's That's everybody's objective, really. But maybe if you haven't been growing vegetables, it would be good to just review some things like they need full sun. Vegetables and fruit need full sun. I mean, really full sun, not, they need 6 to 8 hours of direct sun shining on them during the growing season. And they need water. They're going to need water in the dry weather, and they're only slightly acidic soil. Blueberries are an exception because they need very acidic soil. Blueberries need our native soil without any amendment. Vegetables and fruit generally need soil that has had usually limestone added, depending what your soil is like, but most of us have soil that's quite acidic naturally. And they simply don't take up the nutrients they should have unless the soil acidity has been modified somewhat. Now, vegetables need a lot of nutrients available at their root tips, so to speak, especially nitrogen. Now, fruit trees need good soil, but you don't feed fruit trees like vegetables. Then you get a very unhealthy tree. It grows way too fast and the wood is too soft. So, learn about growing vegetables and fruit. Because healthy plants in good growing conditions, they resist pathogens being able to even get into their leaves. And pests, even if they get some pest attack, they recover so quickly and produce new leaves that it's not an issue. This is a squash that is simply outrunning powdery mildew. Powdery mildew is a fungus that can infect the oldest leaves first, but is having an awful time trying to infect the young and vigorous leaves on this plant because they're resisting infection. Now, we have been confronted with, and it's going to continue, the extreme and variable weather that's been brought as the climate is changing. And this is making it very challenging because some of the things that really damage plants are extreme weather, extreme heat and extreme cold. We've had in recent years examples of all of that, as well as flooding and drought. So it's made it even more challenging for our home gardeners to be able to get a good crop. When we have higher average temperatures and extended periods of extremes, that we have to have some more tools in our toolbox. We need to be able to shade things in the heat, and we need tarps over them when it's cold. And it's like our weather has moved us closer to Winnipeg or something. So we're not on the coastal West Coast anymore. That was the way it was when I moved here 35 or 40 years ago. Our summers are drier, believe it or not. It's been raining all week, but never mind. But they are drier, and we're getting more rain in the winter in some winters. Now, some winters recently, we've actually had functionally winter droughts. This year is one, and last year was one too. Storm intensity and higher winds are a problem. So we don't know when and how all of these things are going to keep affecting us, but we really need to think about every aspect of our growing methods. So rapidly changing and unprecedented conditions. We just have to be able to roll with it and adapt. So I want to show you some examples of some of the heat injury that we're seeing now. Just to remember that the plants that we typically grow for this latitude and for vegetable and fruit gardens, they don't do well in extreme heat. Their growth stops. Photosynthesis slows as it gets hotter and hotter, and it stops somewhere around 32 to 35 degrees C, most of these plants. Now, in the heat dome that we had a couple of years ago, it was far hotter than that on most of our yards. And in the middle of the day in a heat wave last summer, it was hotter than that quite a few times. And when it gets that hot, it can kill cells in the fruit. It can sterilize flowers of tomatoes and peppers. And this is a very common problem now with people trying to grow these crops in greenhouses. They're just getting way too hot too many times during the summer, and there's a lot of fruit loss. So we can, also we get leafy greens that, go to seed much more quickly because it's too hot. So that's just an example. Now I'm going to move on to plant diseases right now, just because it makes it a nice little section. It sort of fits together because prevention, we're in this first part of the talk about prevention. Prevention is all we can do for many plant diseases. There isn't anything else. There's nothing you can magically spray or soak into the soil that will work on a lot of the plant pathogens. But there are some really good preventative methods. So just a little review of plant, pathology 101. the three things have to be present for a plant to actually come down with a disease. So the thing that causes it, the pathogen, has to be present. Okay, if it's not here, then it doesn't matter because the plants won't get infected. The plant has to be susceptible. The disease organism could be here. If the plant isn't susceptible to it, then it still doesn't matter. And then usually there has to be environmental conditions. Usually it's temperature and moisture, say for fungus diseases, that have to be right as well. So you only need to deal really successfully with one of these. Remove the pathogen or get plants that aren't susceptible, or in very few cases, we can alter the environment of the plant. You only need to remove one side of this, triangle, and then we don't have a sick plant. So the first one that is easy to do for a lot of things, vegetables and fruit that we can grow, is we look for disease-resistant varieties. There are virus-resistant peas. There's Peonation mosaic virus is spread in the middle of the summer by aphids. Just takes one aphid to spread the virus to a pea plant. You'd never see that aphid. And there's really no way to control one aphid coming onto your plant. But every seed catalog carries a good range of varieties that are resistant to that disease. Powdery mildew resistance in squash. Now, powdery mildews is a large group of fungi. It's a large group that has all different species of fungi in it. But there are ones that go on peas. There's one that goes on squash and cucumbers, a separate one that goes on grapes. So there's been a lot of plant breeding for resistance to powdery mildew. You can buy scab-resistant apples. There's a lot of apple varieties that are really good and resistant to scab, as well as pears. And there are now increasingly and finally some clubroot resistant varieties of cabbage family plants. So the first stop is disease-resistant varieties, because you don't have to really worry about what you are going to do if the disease shows up. It won't show up. And I'll just show you what kind of difference this makes. There was a really long, prolonged cold, wet spring, 2002. It was wet, like the weather we've just had this week. Well, it was like all of May until the third week of June, which is perfect weather for the fungus that causes apple scab. And this is a tale of two trees. I do love gala apples, and I have a gala tree, much to my dismay most years. This is what those trees looked like in 2022. In fact, there was a complete crop loss because these are blossom clusters that have died. These are apples that weren't too scabby at the small stage. By the end of harvest, this is what they looked like. 20 feet away is my Honeycrisp tree. Fantastic crop, perfect leaves, gorgeous apples. Same yard, same weather, just a resistant versus non-resistant variety. Now we've just removed the susceptible host when we get resistant plants. There's a limited possibility of changing the disease environment because mostly it's related to weather, but we can do something. There's a really annoying and sometimes quite devastating disease called peach leaf curl on peaches and nectarines. And it only can infect during the period when the buds are swelling very, very early, like mostly February. And if you can keep the tree dry at that time, it's not infected. That's it. The rest of the year it can rain on the tree. It doesn't matter. So people can build a temporary peach porch, or you can grow your peach under an overhang. Only the branches sticking out from the overhang will end up looking like this. So we've just modified the environment. And the same thing with late blight on tomatoes. Late blight is a very different kind of organism called a water mold, and it cannot germinate on the leaf unless the leaf actually has free water on it, like not just humid air, but wet. And keeping the leaves dry, it can't germinate. So you can keep the rain off. You can, keep it on plants under an overhang of a roof or something. Don't get irrigation water on them, and be sure that things are well enough ventilated that there's no condensation falling down. I've seen tomatoes get late blight in a tight tunnel in June, not because it was raining, but because there was so much condensation that it essentially was raining inside. So you keep the plants dry from any source of water on their leaves, and you don't have late blight. Protecting bark from injury, this is a very important too. This is rubbing injury. You making sure there isn't the kind of environment or access for pathogens to get into your plants. I actually quite dislike seeing people try espalier fruit trees. It can be done, but you have to be incredibly careful that you're not setting up a situation where any kind of rubbing will damage the bark. In this case, this whole tree is gone because the canker of this is European canker is on the trunk. In this case, a whole branch will be lost. And whether it's string trimmers or lawn mowers or dinging onto posts or wires, just protecting bark from injury is really important. Prune for good air circulation. Now, the thing about air circulation is it dries leaves off very quickly. And many of these fungi, for example, that cause plant diseases have to have a certain number of hours of damp or wet conditions before the spores can germinate. So if you can get the leaves dry quickly, it can often prevent the leaves from being infected, even though the spores are there. So this applies not just for fruit. This is roses or many of our plants. This is very important for. And I'll show you, this is an apple tree. This is the same tree. This is branches at the bottom against a fence where there was a lot of weeds and it was wet and stayed damp. These all have apple scabs so bad that they had to be just picked off. They were never going to mature as apples. These are the apples in the top of the tree. Good air circulation and sunshine. It's the same tree. So it can make quite a difference to have good air circulation through your grapes or your roses or your apples or your fruit. Now, crop rotation is another way to prevent soil-borne pathogens. Basically, what you're doing when you rotate a crop that is susceptible to some kind of disease that lives in the soil, a pathogen that can live in the soil. Now, I'm not talking about leaf diseases here, because pathogens that attack leaves often are just spread on the wind or splashing water. But ones that have to live in the soil and stay there, that's where the spores are. Once you remove the host plant, like if it was, for example, an onion disease, if you don't grow onions in that place for a few years, the spores die. They just lose viability. They didn't find a host. They can't attack any other plants, so you could grow your potatoes or your beans or whatever there, and they wouldn't be infected. But if you put onions there every year, the onions would get more and more infections. So that's what crop rotation accomplishes in a home garden. And that's the main reason to rotate crops in a home garden. That's very different than farming, is to manage disease. So the really important families are the whole onion family, and that means garlics and leeks and scallions and everything, shallots and potatoes. They have the highest risk of really severe root disease. And so wherever you plant these, then next year you don't grow anything like that for the next 4 years. Don't grow any related plants. Cabbage family does have some root diseases problems, but we grow so much cabbage family that it's hard to really get 4 years rotation in most people's gardens. But do what you can. It's a moderate risk family. The big risk is garlic and onions and potatoes. So we want to starve those spores by simply not having host plants there. So that's prevention. So where do we start if there is a problem? Well, all we can do is make sure things are identified correctly. There's nowhere to go if you don't really know what the problem is, if you're guessing, because many of the things that I will suggest that we can use are either they don't involve any kind of toxicity, they're management methods, they're prevention, or barriers and things. They have to be specific to the problem. They don't work on everything. They're not a universal tool. So you need to find out what the problem is. And once you know what it is, there's actually a lot of information about life cycle and biology, and if it's an insect or what its behavior is or its natural enemies. And then you can find out how to prevent and control things. But identification is tricky. And I'll just mention that there's hundreds of pictures identified on my website that you could just click over there and look at the photos, and maybe that will help you identify local problems and pathogens. It's also beneficial, it's insects there. But this is an example of something that looks like a disease, and it's not, it's an insect. And this looks like a disease, and it's actually an aphid. attacking, I think it's a Brussels sprout plant. And there's a lot of little green caterpillars in this world. And which little green caterpillar this is it's a bit tricky to know. It is the hardest part. This really is the hardest part. And, lots of times we're not actually looking at the creature that did the damage anyway. We're just finding damage the next morning. Big holes in leaves. Okay, which one of these was done by caterpillars? Well, it's actually these big ragged holes, but slugs probably are involved too, actually. Birds chew a lot of chunks out of plants and leaves and rip big holes, and they get all that damage done before we ever wake up in the morning. And so they're never seen, nobody ever can believe that birds are in the garden chewing up plants. Slugs, the slugs are having a heyday here on the hostas. Anybody that's grown hostas knows how much that they are just slug candy. But brown spots on leaves, well, gosh, is it insects or fungi or bacteria? Or we've been having hailstorms, and about a week after a hailstorm, little brown or white dots all over leaves are actually hail damage from an earlier storm. And if a plant wilts, what's wrong with it? I mean, it could be a disease in the roots. It could be insects in the roots. It could be, maybe it's not been as watered as well as you thought. Maybe it's just wilting because it's just too darn hot today, and the plants have to wilt to basically preserve their moisture, and it'll come back in the evening. So this is hard. I have this example, and if any of you have seen any of my talks, I'm sure you've all seen this one. Is this a lady beetle that has gone over to the dark side? Well, no, actually, it's eating these incredibly tiny little sawfly larvae. And this is really, this is obviously a picture under a microscope, right? Or a very close-up view. If you saw that lady beetle, I'm sure you wouldn't have even noticed these. So this is very common that beneficial insects are present on damaged leaves. They're there because of the pests and the smell from the damaged leaf. That's what has attracted them to it. And then if they don't look like a lady beetle, you don't recognize it, and then people start spraying. And this is another example. It's in the soil. It's exactly the size and shape of a wireworm, except it's blonder. It's cream colored. And it's a predator of wireworms. And I know people have told me that they've seen yellow wireworms and they've seen white ones. Well, the white one is the fly larva that has punched that hole in that wireworm and eaten it. So it's not easy. And, jumping to conclusions, you really need to take time to figure out what you're looking at, because there's a lot of natural enemies out there, and they're always where the pests are. So we don't want to confuse the two. If you see an insect on a damaged leaf, just don't assume it's the culprit. I have a couple examples here. This is a larva of a native lady beetle. That's a weird looking little creature. It's eating a cottony cushion scale, which is a sucking insect. Over here, we have the larva of a different lady beetle, which looks like a white cottony thing, but it's eating these aphids. And both of these were just taken in my garden, so they're not, you will see these. So that's just to kind of beware and make sure that you get things identified. Now, I'm going to talk about disorders because, these are often mistaken for disease. So here's the hail example. This is what I meant by little dinghy marks all over your leaves. It does look like disease. And this is some poor little seedling that was beautifully reared under grow lights, then moved out to the garden and into the sun on a nice warm day. And the poor thing has died from sunburn because the cells were not given time. The leaf cells hadn't been exposed to real, true, full spectrum sunlight long enough to get the plant used to it. It was like us getting a sunburn. In this case, it got such a severe sunburn because it had never been in the sun that it died. So physical injury, hail, chemicals, road salt, sulfur sprays, nutrient deficiencies, soil acidity, poor watering, all of these things can cause symptoms in plants. Heat and drought injury gets quite severe. Well, drought makes heat injury even worse, but even in a really well-watered garden, there is a point at which it is too hot for plants in a heat wave. What plants do to protect the moisture in their cells is they close up the pores that are on the underside of the leaf that's actually where the carbon dioxide gets in and the oxygen gets out, but moisture also gets out. Evaporation of moisture. It's the transpiration process in the plant. I don't need to get all complicated here, but what it really means is once they close those pores up to retain the moisture in the leaf, they lose their cooling system. It's like somebody turned the air conditioning off and suddenly the leaf temperatures jump up. But from the plant's point of view, it's less damaging to get a few burns on your leaves and have some cells die than it is to have the whole plant at risk. But while those pores are closed, they can't photosynthesize either. So they can't make any food. They also are not transpiring, so there's no water coming up from the roots. And that's where the nutrients should be getting into the plant, is on that water. So that's not happening either. So they're basically starving and sitting there. So they're not growing. So when you see a bed like this, where a lot of different unrelated plants have the same kind of damage, that tells you that there's something wrong with the growing environment. It's not likely to be disease if it's a lot of different plants with the same injury. And drought stress just makes this all happen at lower temperatures. So it might even be, an ordinary 23-degree day, but the plants don't have enough water. This whole thing can set up then. So this is what sun scald looks like. Sun injury on fruit, an early May heat wave, damaging rhododendrons. This is what it looks like on raspberries. Quite soon, this damaged and killed tissue from heat will now rot. Their pathogens or, decomposer fungi move in, and then it'll look like the raspberries died of some kind of fungus. They didn't. That was heat injury. And extreme heat causes all kinds of growth problems, and like this poor tomato, partially sterilized pollen. This is extreme heat on corn and cauliflower. We all know what cauliflower does in the summer. As soon as it gets hot, it all comes apart. These tomatoes were actually sun scalded, and this is the decomposer fungus that's moved in later to this damaged tissue. It is now living on the injured cells. So this is not the disease that caused this injury. This is a cleaning, a decomposer that's moving into to a place where damaged tissue is available to it. And this is just, it's too darn hot, too hot and too sunny on tomato fruit. Those cells will never ripen. They've already been injured by heat. We do have some metabolic disorders in plants that are quite common in tomatoes and apples, for example, and some other crops. And it's an interaction between a lot of things going on with how you care for the plant, what the weather is like, nutrients in the soil. It all influences, in this case, mostly their calcium disorders. Calcium is in the soil. Calcium has to get up to the plant cells in the soil water through transpiration, and it's taken up, and the plant moves the calcium around in its tissues as it needs it. But calcium is a difficult mineral to move around. It doesn't move readily through plants. So when the plant's a bit stressed, the calcium isn't moving very well. If it's droughty and the plant goes through this process or hot and closes up those leaf pores, then calcium isn't going anywhere. And we get some really severe and strange disorders due to calcium deficiency. Both of these, in this case, tip burn on lettuce and this blossom end rot, these are not diseases. This is calcium deficiency in the fruit, usually from heat or drought stress. So just a quick chart here. How do you know if it's diseases or if it's something wrong with the growing conditions? Well, the first one is, we'll go back to that third rule that I showed you. If it's just on one group of plants, one variety or one genus or one very closely related group of plants, and not on anything else in the same growing conditions, then it could be a disease. If it's a disorder, it's going to affect a lot of different plants similarly. If you see spores, well, it's fungus disease. Spores are usually not present with the disorder. Spores are only present if the damaged tissue has been so damaged that it starts to basically be rotted, be decomposed or attacked by decomposing fungi. And if it's a disease of plants, it usually starts on the oldest leaves and progresses gradually as the plants kind of age. And like here again, we have the older leaves of this squash affected. If it's a disorder, especially if it's something like an injury, it can occur suddenly. It can be all on one side of a plant that was hot against the sun, or it can be in the lower part if it's cold weather. So it's very quick and not at all like new leaves, old leaves. It's like a certain part of the plant. And if the weather or whatever the conditions are improved, the new growth starts looking fine. Like this is heat injured grape leaves, and the new growth isn't injured because it wasn't out in the heat. Whereas a pathogen, eventually you would begin to see it spread. The weather is an important clue for both of them. So the weather might be damp and cool and moist and conducive to certain pathogens, but it might be hot and the soil might have been dry, and that is actually a heat injury that you're looking at. So keep an eye on problems. But really, just this is called monitoring when you do it on a farm. In a home garden, it's like just keep an eye on things. Look closely, do it regularly, get the phone out and take pictures. Keep notes. Your photo records are really important because they'll have a date already on them, even if you forget to make a note about the date. And it will tell you what the plant looked like last week or a couple weeks ago, and you can compare. And also, many problems occur at the same time every year. A lot of insects only have one generation a year. Tent caterpillars are out only when tent caterpillars are out in the spring. When they're done wandering, there's nothing the rest of the year. No tent caterpillars. There's no more generations. So keep an eye on it, keep records. Some plants are not affected at all, some are affected. If you know when to look for the problem next year, you might be able to nip it in the bud a lot earlier and prevent any severe damage. So by just checking regularly, you can tell if things are getting better or worse. Often because we see leaves that are already damaged to their maximum, we come back later and nothing really changes. That's what inspections tell you. If things are still continually getting chewed, then you know that there's something that maybe you need to do to intervene. You also can tell if beneficial insects are present. And if you did anything, if you did any kind of treatment, did it work? If they're still crawling around chewing on things. If you had the leaves of your gooseberries or currants were chewed up like this, and you sprayed the caterpillar biological control, BTK, on the caterpillar looking things that were chewing up these leaves, if you came back a few days later, you would see that they were absolutely unaffected. It's because these insects look like caterpillars, but they're not. So you can spray BTK all day and it will have no effect on them because it can't infect them. So that's a clue that maybe you misidentified this. Actually, this is what you need to look for. In the spring, you can find the eggs being laid on your gooseberry or your currants and remove the leaves, and you never get to this point. So it's always possible that you don't need to take action because it depends on your tolerance. This looks horrible. This is that white cabbage butterfly. The caterpillars are chewing away on this cabbage. Lots of damage here on the outer leaves, but if you were just to chop the first layer of leaves off, that cabbage underneath is fine. So you don't need to tell the kids there was little worms all over their cabbage. You can just put that in the compost bin and forget it. On the other hand, this is kale and the caterpillar's eating what I wanted to eat. And so now we have a problem. And this is you may not just, this is an example of damage that you just may not have found the damage while it was still fresh enough that there was creatures there doing the chewing. This is the same insect that was doing the damage on this slide, but so long ago that the edges are dry and brown. There's nothing you can do at this point except make a note for next year to prevent that from happening. And it may be that you just find a lot of natural enemies already present. So there's lots of reasons why you may not need to take action. And look closely for the natural enemy. Begin to understand what the eggs look like. Lady beetle eggs look like little upright deposits of bright orange eggs. Syrphid flies, which eat aphids, they just are single little white eggs. Get, a hand lens, a good magnifying lens, or, using the camera on your phone at the magnification, that's usually pretty good. That's usually enough for you to be able to see this kind of thing. And understand what the different life cycles look like. This is an adult lady beetle. but it's coming out of a pupa case. So this is not some weird sucking creature. This is just a normal stage of lady beetles. So this, you might see this is that plum aphid example that I was showing you earlier. Here we have aphids all over a leaf, and we've got one big fat larva of a fly that the larvae eat these aphids. Is that enough to do the job? Well, actually, yeah, because these are eggs all over. There are so many eggs on this leaf that I'm just like walking away from this. They have got it handled. They give it a few more days and you'll come back and there just won't be any aphids there, because each one of these, when it hatches out, can eat hundreds of aphids. So we need to decide if treatment is necessary. So, did you catch it in time to do anything? Are there natural enemies present? Do you still need to do anything? It's going to depend on also what kind of damage is being done. Like one caterpillar here he goes, came out of the middle of this apple and went romping away. So yeah, that's pretty damaging. Although the rest of the apple is perfectly usable in a pie or applesauce, you have to cut this piece out. You can't obviously sell this apple, but the rest of the apple is salvageable. This caterpillar is only a leaf eater and it's probably done that damage there. And it's of no consequence whatsoever to the tree, the harvest, the crop, the gardener, nothing. So it really depends what species it is and what it's doing. So moving on to the things that we've got in our toolbox, and the focus is on non-toxic things. And most of them are prevention, or they might be called physical or cultural controls, like blasting water off, blasting aphids off with water. It's hardly a chemical control. It's not a spray, but it's the pressure of the water that's doing the damage, so to the aphids. So we do need to understand how these controls work, because they only work on certain pests. You can blast aphids off with water because of the way their mouth parts are, but there are a lot of things you can't blast off with water. And some of these things have to be done at exactly the right time. We can prevent carrots from ever having even one little carrot root fly, rust fly maggot in the roots, but only if we cover the carrot bed before the carrots come up. Once the carrots are up, there's undoubtedly rust flies in there. So you have to use things correctly for them to be effective. So we can physically remove things. You can snip out a little tent caterpillar nest in April and prevent damage to the rest of a tree. We can pick off eggs. We can remove infested things. This is a branch with European canker on an apple tree I have. I removed it about 12 years ago and I've never seen another incident since. So you can physically clean up in some cases and successfully have a long-term control. In some cases, we can use traps. This is a sticky trap for winter moth on an apple tree. Winter moth is an insect that arrived here in, 1970s, I think. And biological controls have been released here. So there's a fly and a wasp that attack them. The ground beetles that I showed you earlier, among the ground dwelling insects, they attack them. So there's a lot of good, help out there controlling winter moth. But another thing we can do is put sticky bands up, but we only do it in October and we take them down in February. Sticky bands on trees are really quite detrimental at other times of the year because of all the harm they do to other insects. So we just want them at the time of year that it matters. Yellow sticky traps work great for white flies and fungus gnats, but only indoors. Once you take those outdoors, you're catching aphid predators. And wireworm traps, this works great for wireworms. We can put a chunk of potato on a skewer and stick it in the soil and catch wireworms. Water sprays work. I mentioned aphids earlier, but sawfly larvae can be washed off, thrips and spider mites, and also powdery mildews, which are an interesting group of pathogens, require the leaves to be dry, but the air to be humid. So if you actually get the leaves wet, then powdery mildew spores can't germinate. Barriers for insects is a key thing for some really quite damaging pests that we have can be very easily solved once in the growing season, simply by preventing the insect from laying the eggs on the plant. Both cabbage family and the carrot family have a insect that comes to those plants and lays its eggs right where the plant is the stem is in contact with the soil. In this case, it's a cabbage root maggot. In the case of carrots, it's a carrot rust fly. They do the same kind of thing. But the insect won't lay its eggs out here, and it won't lay its eggs on lettuce because that's not its host. So it's only on its host plant, only in that place. So we just need to prevent the female from getting to the carrots in this case, or even just in this case on these larger cabbage family plants, we just put a little barrier around the roots. And this is a barrier, a typical barrier, 6 inches, 15 centimeters square, cut a little slit. Needs to be something waterproof. If you buy compost in bags, those are perfect. Just cut some squares out of that and cut a slit to the middle. What we're trying to achieve here is a very tight fit to the stem. And then we just mulch over it and guard. That's it for the life of the plant. You put the barrier in place and leave it. But if you plant the plant and come back a few weeks later and put the barrier on, it's quite likely that insect has already visited and laid its eggs in the roots. So this is something that has to be done at the right time. We can cover whole plants. I just showed you carrot bed that was completely covered, but we can cover to keep out birds and current or fruit flies. A lot of different species of fruit flies attack our plants. And remake can be kept used as a cover for something that's very soft like strawberries. Otherwise, you need to actually go to proper insect netting. It's very strong, long lasting. And here's some of the brand names that are around. I think Russell Nursery probably still has Protect Net, but you'll see Enviro Mesh and Bug Out is common in a lot of the nurseries. So this is really tough fabric that allows 95% of sunlight to get through. Rain can get through, but it prevents insects, but it's fantastic for preventing birds as well. We can bag individual fruit. Now, before everybody throws up their hands and says that's too much trouble, think about how easy it is to bag a fruit, how much easier it is than it is to cover a whole tree or cover a whole grapevine. These bags have kept raccoons out of my grapes for 20 years. In fact, I started making the bags when I planted the grapevines 22 years ago, and every year I just made some more. And now, and they're tough and they keep out fruit flies, birds, yellow jackets, and everything else, but they actually can keep raccoons out. So the different ways of bagging fruit can certainly keep a lot of pest problems at bay. And one of our really big assets is that we can do things to encourage the native beneficial insects, the biological control insects, to come into the garden and live there and just do the job. And we don't even see it happening lots of times. We have no idea how many caterpillars or aphids or whatever might have been in our gardens because they're already eaten by insects or birds or other animals. So thousands of species, literally. So what we need to do is provide them with food and water and a safe environment. So food, both adults and larvae. Now, mainly, and I'm including pollinators here too, because we need those as well. Adults of pollinators need flower nectar and pollen. A safe environment, now without pesticides, for many reasons we want to do that, but we also, night lighting is actually quite disruptive of insects' lives, bug zappers. We don't want any of those things in the environment. Providing drinking water, I'll show you that in a moment. When it's dry, these insects are not eating leaves, they are eating other creatures and they need water and they need safe places to nest. So we can plant to specifically attract them because most of these beneficial insects the adults eat pollen and nectar and they lay their eggs among the pests. And when the eggs hatch, the larvae are the stage that are the meat eaters, that they're the predators. So it's been well proven and it's thoroughly established in agriculture systems that you plant the plants to attract the adult insect. And when she gets there and finds her own food, that's the first place she starts to look for pests to lay her eggs in. because obviously a mother insect is going to be very, very careful about where she puts her eggs. Once the little tiny eggs hatch, they have no ability to go anywhere. They have to be in the food supply. So things like in a garden, dill and cilantro, things that have gone to seed, parsley in its second year, are very attractive to a lot of these predators. Sweet alyssum is probably the fastest universal fix for almost every garden, vegetable garden pest. It's easy to get. You've seen it in every garden nursery, and that really deep sweet smell that you smell is nectar. And everybody comes to get nectar from this plant. And you can plant it in the garden, you can plant it in the pathways around your garden, or just as long as it's in the yard. It doesn't have to be right underneath your plants. And there are a lot of other good plants, goldenrod and yarrow and candy tuft. A lot of these are perennials that you could have in other part of your yard. So, oops, I already showed you that. The tiny flowers is what we're really looking for. Mostly because these insects, this lady beetle isn't too small, but most of the insects that are actually really effective are really tiny, and they would drown in big nectar pools. So they come to these very tiny flowers, these umbelliferae. Here is cilantro over here, and here is a little sweet alyssum plant among the cabbage plant family. And I'll show you just an easy fix for a greenhouse in the spring. If you've got peppers and basil and all that kind of stuff, and you see aphids in there, throw open the doors and windows, get the vents wide open, take the screens off if there are any, and move in some sweet alyssum plants in bloom. And this is just a little slide set that I did one year for mine. Within 24 hours, I had adult syrphid flies in there, and she's curving her abdomen down to lay an egg. On the underside of this leaf, there's aphids, and this is what it looks like. This is the leaf with aphids. There's a couple, there's probably an egg there too. There's an egg there, there's an egg there. A couple weeks, a week later, this is what there is. 2 big fat hoverfly larvae. So they will clean this up pretty quick, and all you have to do is provide food for the female insect to come in. And water is a really good thing to provide for insects. And if you're doing a bird bath or anything like that, that's fine, but just make sure insects cannot drown. That's the key thing here. This person had a kind of a plasticky little watering thing here, and bees were drowning all the time. We just simply put a piece of slate in there and made a little bee beach. Many of these insects are much smaller than bees, and they get caught in the surface tension of the water, and they just drown. They can't get out. So rocks, floating pieces of wood, all of these just help these insects to climb out. And, treat it like a bird bath. Make sure that you change the water frequently so mosquitoes don't live there. And as I said earlier, these ground dwellers are really important. So the ways we protect them is minimize cultivation and soil disturbance. And, gardens that have lots of mulches in the pathways and living plants and perennials here and there, that's a really good environment to keep these animals happy. The less disturbance, the better. It gives them a stable place to live. And, a lot of beneficial insects as well, they have a stage like those hoverflies that I showed you. They actually drop to the soil to pupate. So they need some safe time there in the soil that's not being cultivated and disturbed, so they can emerge again and go away and look for aphids, or a lot of them overwinter there. So disturbing the soil can get not just the ground predators, but insects that are up on the leaves. So minimizing cultivation, use organic mulches, no-till methods, and delay the garden cleanup. Until, if you're cleaning up the garden late in the fall, you're going to do a lot of damage to beneficial insects. Do your garden cleanup in the spring after you start seeing insects around. They've emerged, and go ahead and clean things up. So the last, important sort of group of or consideration for natural enemies is there are some that are available for sale, and should you buy them? There are very few that are actually useful for gardens. Most of what is available is for the commercial greenhouse crops, where they're quite effective, but it takes a lot of skill and knowledge to use them correctly on that scale. They are expensive, and they are perishable. You can't mail them for very far, and you can't just keep them around and use them later. If you put them in the garden, they have to be put out at when the pests are present that you want to control. So it's not impossible. If you needed to buy aphid midges, for example, they would work very well. But they're very common outdoors here. You actually wouldn't need to buy them to release them here if you had a garden that was attracting the females in and providing nectar. Some things are really ineffective, and unfortunately, praying mantis, for some reason, recent years, a lot more praying mantis egg masses have been sold again. They're around and they're getting established. This is an introduced non-native insect, and it eats anything. It eats butterflies. It eats lacewings, which are beneficial insects. It's eating a grasshopper here. When praying mantids are little, they eat little things, and when they're bigger, they eat big things. But there's no way they are a pest control because they have no discrimination. Whereas in this case, this aphid predator only eats aphids. It doesn't eat anything else. You can buy insect parasitic nematodes and soak there for stages of insects in the soil, but you have to really know what you're doing here. There's a lot of hype in this particular product, and it's unfortunately you're not well protected by consumer legislation in Canada. Basically, the suppliers of these can pretty much tell you anything because they're not registered as a pesticide, which means they would have to go through all kinds of testing and they'd have to work and everything. And they're too big to be, they're not a biological control that's regulated in any way. So they only work for a few things, not wireworms, not pill bugs, not earwigs. And they have to be released at the right time. They are quite effective on weevil larvae. So most gardens, that's a problem only in ornamentals and rhododendrons, and they can be quite effective there. And they're expensive and they're perishable. So just before you consider this, do a little bit of research. The bacterial spray disease that I talked about earlier, BTK, is a registered pesticide because in Canada, microorganisms, which are much smaller than the nematodes I just showed you, have to be registered through the Pesticide Control Act. And so it is a biological control, and it controls caterpillars. Not all species are susceptible to it, but it is quite useful if you have to use something for caterpillars because it doesn't harm other insects get it on it or eat it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't affect them. That said, I actually can't remember in the last 25 years if I've ever needed it in anything in my garden. So it's out there, but you shouldn't really need it. And other kinds of pesticides, even the least toxic ones, really, just avoid them if you can. They should be a last resort. There's a very limited list now of pesticides that are available to home gardeners unless you have training. And it's a perfectly adequate list. There's the BT. The BT, the kale and clay, which isn't readily available, and the slug bait are the least risky for beneficial insects. Some of these other things, mineral oil, pyrethrin soap, they're around and can be used, but it's just extremely unlikely that you would need to use them. You do hear about botanical insecticides because certified organic growers, there are insecticides that they're allowed to use under certain circumstances. It's very much more regulated now. But just because it came from a plant doesn't mean it's safe. Pyrethrins are nerve toxins. They're actually of an intermediate toxicity. If you look at the scale of all the pesticides, they are as toxic as some of the chemical based products that people used to use. They have a very fast knockdown, and any insect can be affected. And they're moderately toxic to people and pets, and you should definitely never let a cat lick itself, get pyrethrins on it. So they're just because they're natural doesn't mean that they're safe really to be used. They're rarely needed. Even dormant oil sprays, which I still occasionally hear people being told to just routinely spray dormant oil. These are horticultural oil sprays that are applied when deciduous trees have lost their leaves, and so they don't burn the leaves. Oil would burn the leaves. But it's not, there's no need to do it. There's a lot of beneficial organisms that live on trees in the cracks and crevices of the bark that would be killed by this. So you only use a dormant oil spray if there was something on the tree that's growing season that you knew it was there and that it was something that was actually the oils would be effective on. For example, people often think they're going to kill tent caterpillar eggs and they are not with oil sprays. It's just not going to work. If there was severe aphids on a fruit tree by fall, aphid eggs on the leaves, it would be killed. But winter moth eggs, yes, certain kinds of scale. If you had an apple that looked like this is an oyster shell scale, then you schedule yourself in, schedule that tree for a dormant oil spray next winter. Cherry sawfly, I wouldn't bother scheduling in an oil spray because you can also wash these off with water in the growing season. And are homemade sprays better? Well, no, not only are they illegal, they simply are not legal. People can do a lot of damage to their own plants with things they've made out of soap or detergent or oil or, oh gosh, people do all kinds of things. I've even heard of people using gasoline on the weeds and, things that are really toxic and nasty environmentally. And they remember if it's going to work on pests, it's going to kill beneficials. And the other something that people don't realize is that even something that you might think was fairly innocuous, like using soap, it changes the smell of the leaf. And remember that earlier picture I showed you of the lady beetle that was eating those little tiny sawfly larvae that you couldn't see? When the leaf is, the smell is changed, the predators can't find the pests, or it upsets them. They can't lay their eggs. They don't want to come there. Many years ago, I did research on aphid predators. Aphids, notoriously, you spray them with soap and that knocks them down, but then they come back. Only guess what doesn't come back? The aphid predators won't come back and lay their eggs on the leaves where you sprayed the soap, even though the aphids came back. So it's a very subtle effect because people don't realize how sensitive these insects are. So when you start spraying, even with something you think is least toxic and safe, it still gets you into a cycle of having to keep spraying. So prevention is usually the most reliable way to avoid damage. You've got to identify things correctly, or really there isn't anything you can do. And then keeping an eye on problems, keeping records. I mean, a lot of that you're going to discover there wasn't anything you needed to do. You can decide if treatment is necessary, and it just often isn't. And then I showed you some examples of a lot of different approaches, and you can use these together. Several things together work and give you a better result than just one. And always, no matter what you do, follow up and check and see if it worked. And plan for next year. I mean, if you just missed it and you got damaged, then once you understand what the pest or disease problem is, make sure you learn enough about it that you'll catch it at the right time next year. And oh, here's the last one. I should make this rule number 7, don't panic. Very little that ever happens to any of our plants happens quickly or is totally fatal. Late blight happens fast and it's totally fatal. Okay, that's true. But most things develop slowly, or they don't result in any significant injury or damage. So just make sure you know what the problem is before you do anything. So I hope we've got time for questions. We've probably got half an hour for questions. What did we have in the, can we see everybody? Can we see our participants?
Yeah, I just allowed everyone to be able to turn their cameras on and their mics on. So if you're comfortable asking a question, please feel free.
Yeah. What do we have in the chat?
We do have, so from Frankie, good to know that many of the non-toxic methods I've used are still good. I also use fruit bags on my figs and it confuses the raccoons. Good.
Yeah. And it does
comment.
stop the birds from pecking away at your figs too.
Good. Are there any other questions for Linda? Bonnie has powdery mildew on azaleas.
On azaleas or dahlias?
Azaleas.
Azaleas. Are you sure it's powdery mildew? That's the problem. You see, there are other fungal diseases. So there is a powdery mildew that does go on rhododendrons and azaleas, and it looks very different than the powdery mildew pictures that I showed you. And in the case of, if it is the one that goes on the rhodos and possibly on azaleas, there isn't really anything you can do except get better air circulation, and maybe, I don't know if the plant is in the shade, but get it out in the sun. That will help a lot. Is the person that asked that question, is she on here still?
She is, yet. So
Yeah,
I've
everybody can
opened
go
up the
unmute
chat.
if you want to and ask your questions, or,
Feel free.
feel free. Bring your camera up if you want to look at us. We can look at you. You can look at us, but we can look at you.
I just realized it looks like the chat wasn't working. I'm having trouble with Zoom this evening.
Yeah, it's been
my fault. But it looks like I fixed it now, so
okay, if you put something in the Zoom, go ahead and do it again, but there's so few of us, you can just unmute and ask your question. It'll be fine. Well, maybe they're all
everyone's
asleep.
shy. Yeah. I don't really have any questions, but that was really very, very, very interesting. And I'm really grateful for you to take the time. Oh, she said, sorry, my phone is acting up. Yes, the azalea is a bit crowded.
Yeah, get that spaced out, maybe you can move it. It's actually quite possible to move azaleas and rhodos. They have a big disc of roots, and so it's actually pretty easy to move them, or thin things around them and get some good air circulation there. Good.
When is the best time you think to move plants if you're noticing they're crowded?
Well, the sooner the better, because if you move it too late, they need a lot of water to get through a summer, and we're going to shortly be short on water. So it's always in our climate, if you're planning a move and have the luxury of time, do it in the fall, because plants have the winter to get their roots established where you don't have to water them, and they will need less water their first summer next summer. If you move them now, you've got another week or two of wet soil, and then it might be quite dependent on you watering. So I would try and do what I could by pruning around that plant. And then if I want to move it, I'd schedule a move this fall when it starts getting wet again.
Okay. Good tips. Do you have any pruning tips I think, is it correct that a lot of different things have different rules?
They do. You really need to do a little research. Some things you prune them right after they flower, for success, so have a good flowers next year. Other things you prune them when they're dormant in the wintertime, and other things you really don't need to prune unless it's just getting too big or you want to keep them into shape, so there's different objectives. Fruit trees, we prune them to, get good air and light on the fruit, and not to let the tree get unstable, like branches that are too long and can't support the fruit, have good strong branches, things like that. So it really does depend what the plant is.
Right. Okay. Cool. Thank you. I found it really interesting to see. In my garden I have a lot of, and I was just calling them centipedes, but they're obviously ground beetle larvae. Now I know that, so
well,
it's
there
a big
are
learning moment.
centipedes and there are millipedes, and the millipedes are fast and they're the predators, and the centipedes curl right up when you disturb them.
Oh
And then
yes, I
there's
have
ground
noticed
beetle
that.
larvae, which are very fast and wiggly. So
Okay. More to learn.
more to learn. Yeah, you look at the pictures on my website. There's there's some pictures there that would help. I noticed. I have to tell you something in my in this book. I had added finally, because everybody asks at this time of year what the little fine golden threads are on the little worms. They're very, very thin. They're on the soil surface or on plants right now in this wet
Yes.
weather. Yeah, everybody asks what they are. So I thought, okay, I'll put them in the book this year, because then this is new edition, and then I won't have to, and people are still asking me because they're beneficial. They're a native nematode that parasitizes insects, but nobody's looking in the beneficial part of the book for it. They're all looking in the pest section. So they're myrmidid nematodes, and they're quite common. They mostly parasitize bigger insects like grasshoppers and earwigs and stuff. And they're only out at this one time a year and only when the conditions are exactly right. But they can be really quite common and unnerving if you think that they're a pest, and they're not. They're not a pest at all.
Oh, that's very good to know. That's very good to know. Yeah, I see that quite a bit. So
Yeah,
that's cool.
yeah,
Yeah, that's a
yeah.
good thing. That's good.
Good to know.
That's
Yeah.
good. Yeah. Great. Well, do you have any more slides that you would be interested in showing anyone? Or I know you had
Well,
a
we
couple.
can go back to, something that's common is wireworms. And I want to just, with this aphids, I really talked about them. And here's some of the wild and woolly little critters that all attack aphids. This is a little wasp that's so small, she lays her egg inside an aphid, and the next wasp develops inside the aphid.
Wow.
These are all beneficial insects here. This is another one that attacks pea aphids. This is this little midge that attacks aphids, hoverflies, so lots of them. Oh, yeah, and I'll show you this, and then I'll do wireworms. This is an example of a aphid colony that looks like, oh my gosh, it's a big mess, except that most of these are dead aphids. All of these are aphid skins or shriveled up aphids, and all the arrows are pointing to predators or parasites. There's a little orange larva there and there, oops, there, and I think there's probably others there underneath the aphids you can't see. That's the aphid midge. These are hoverfly larvae here. And these funny looking aphids have been parasitized by that little wasp that I just showed you, this one that's laying its eggs here. And now it's just using the aphid's body as its own pupa case. So most of these aphids are dead. Oh, there's a little larva there. So every time I look at this, I find another one. So my rule of thumb, I did research on aphid predators for many years. We discovered that when we're out in the field, you can only see 1 in 10. And if you took the sample back to the lab and incubated it out and counted everything on the leaves, you would find 10 times more little creatures that are eating aphids. The eggs would be there and other stages. So my rule of thumb is if you see one that you can identify, you can count on the fact that there's 10 you can't see. And that's kind of like that picture I showed you earlier with one syrphid fly larva and then all the eggs that are there. There was, 8 or 9 eggs. Wireworms, this is quite a problem in veggie gardens, burrowing into potatoes, carrots, any root crops. And if you grow dahlias and other, things with tubers, they will bore into that as well. And the thing about these is they actually take 3 to 4 years to mature. So the beetles come and lay their eggs in the spring on grasses and weeds in your garden. Or they may be in the lawn already before you made a garden. And it takes 4 years for them to develop from teeny little worms up to these larger size. And so if you make a new garden where a lawn was this year, you've got lots of these in the lawn. You just do. And it's going to take a while for them to be developed and leave the garden. So what you're trying to do is make sure that no new adult beetles come and lay more eggs in your garden. So the first thing you need to do is make sure that you don't have weeds in your garden over the winter. Like this is where a nice thick leaf mulch comes in. These insects won't lay their eggs on leaf mulch. But if you had fall rye in the garden or lots of weeds and things, come April, this is a dandy place for these beetles to lay their eggs. So you never break the cycle. So first start breaking the cycle. And then, for the next few years, trap them before you plant. So chunks of potato on a skewer, buried in the soil an inch or 2 deep, and just leave, every couple days come along, pull it up and destroy the wireworms. Now I'm quite cheap. I just put the same chunk of potato back in the garden, but you can clean a garden bed out really quite well before you plant. And you'll have to keep doing that, hand pick the wireworms if you see, and they're actually shiny and the soil doesn't stick to them. So they're quite easy to see. And just have faith, it'll get better. If you keep trapping them out as they develop, they'll leave and they won't come back if there's no place for them to lay their eggs. So it'll be bad the first year after a lawn. It won't be so bad the next year. And it'll tail off, and then it'll be just the odd one that you'll see after that. You can also just plant late. That helps. It's the
Okay.
early crops, the early potatoes, excuse me, things like that that really get attacked because these wireworms go deeper in the soil as the soil gets warmer.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So I think that was kind of my key ones. That's what we're still finding pretty damaging in a garden.
Okay. Very interesting. I worry about my dahlias.
Yes, but they just make a hole in the dahlia tuber. They won't kill it unless it's a
Okay.
massive amount. They really arise in a vegetable garden because you harvest your potatoes, they got all these little dings in them.
Yeah.
Again, that's actually not gonna harm that potato from being useful in your kitchen. But a grower can't sell a potato that looks like that. But your dahlias, usually it heals up just like this. So the tuber will have a scar like this and you'll know what it is, but it's not usually a killer to the dahlia or even much in the way of damage.
Okay. And you said to do that before planting. Could you do it with a potato trick? Could you do that while you have plants in the ground?
Sure, but the other plants you have in the ground will be equally attracting them. So yes, you could,
Okay.
if you've already planted, you could still do this. It's just not going to be as effective as if you had only the potatoes available to them.
Okay, I
But
see.
yeah, absolutely give it a try. And it'll at least tell you how many were there.
Yeah.
And you may only find one or two, and it's not a big deal. But if you
Okay.
get a big mass of them, then you'll know that you've really got to, you know,
Next year.
get
Yeah.
on it. Yeah. Yeah. And just make
Okay.
sure that, things are under mulch, under leaves all winter. Come April, there's nowhere for those insects to come and lay their eggs. They'll keep laying them in the lawn still, but they won't lay them in your garden.
Okay. Cool. Good to know. Thank you. Well,
Well, if nobody else has any questions,
yeah.
we're good.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Natasha says thank you. Very informative. It was very informative. We're very thankful to have you here to talk to us. Linda will be joining us again on what day?
Someday next month. Where am
Someday
I?
next month.
Someday next month.
Here we go.
No, that's Hort Center of the Pacific.
On
Ooh.
June 19th, we'll
No,
be talking
is it
about,
June 19th?
I believe
Oh,
so.
no. I hope not, because I just scheduled something else on June. Oh my gosh.
Okay,
Okay,
I
you
can
and me
double
will have to
check.
talk about this. We might have to move it. I just, oh dear. Too
I
many.
can check my calendar. I might have the day wrong.
Um,
Um, but Linda will be joining us at some point
at
in
some
June
point,
to
talking about
talk about
lawns. Yeah. Oh
to
dear.
talk
Yeah,
about
lawns.
lawns, natural lawn care, um, and turf management. Um, and that's a big thing for the residents of Victoria. We love our lawns here. Lots of people let their lawns go golden, and we really uh, commend that. But there are still some green lawns here, and irrigation is a big water user in the summer. So I'm really excited to talk to Linda about that and different ways that you can support a lawn without overwatering and etc. So,
And not having weeds. I
and
can
not having weeds.
talk
Yeah,
about how not to have weeds in your lawn without breaking your back.
totally.
Anyway,
Yeah, I'm
and we may be
excited.
changing the date, so I'm sorry. We'll
That's
get
okay.
on to that.
We'll deal with that tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah, tomorrow
Okay,
problem.
thanks for visiting, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Linda, again.
Yeah,
That was great.
yeah. I'll talk to you later, Danielle. I'll look
Yeah.
up my dates here and make it back to you tomorrow.
Okay. Sounds
Bye
good.
bye.
No problem. All right. Good night, everyone.